I guess I can start with you, Esla. We can say something about International Women's Day. And I am asking myself, really, is there a significance for it anymore? Because the last time I checked, all those who are getting the first classes in the schools are 90% women. And women are blazing the trail almost everywhere else. So the question of inequality, is it really still there?
The inequality is in the numbers. And let me say good morning to your viewers and listeners this morning. It's always a pleasure to be here. And I'm glad you've got 3 females here this morning. Well done.
Thank you. I'm listening to you.
Yes, the inequality is in the numbers. And the theme for this year's celebration is Pledge for Parity. By 2030, we should be getting parity in the numbers at all levels. 50 men, 50% males, 50% females.
Right.
Everywhere across the
Madam
board.
Monakote had just taken her seat. I'd like to say welcome.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. She was here quite early on. Right, so go on.
So that's what we need to start taking the deliberate policies and working on so that we will attain that goal by 2030.
You see, it's in the numbers.
Yes, the disparities in the numbers. And that's where women have always been excelling in schools. The few who make it there always do us proud. So it's nothing new. So we need to get more because we're wasting our valuable human resources by not giving them, creating the conditions to enable them to also contribute their quota to the development of our country. If the few in there are doing such wonderful work, what would it do to the country if we create the conditions for a lot more women to assist our male counterparts at all levels, in governance, in academia, in businesses, in the homes, everywhere? That is what the country is
You've been a
losing.
leader of FIDA before, correct?
Absolutely.
Right. Now, the time when you were in the sort of the forefront, and I think if I say so, you might challenge it because you're still in the forefront of championing women's issues even within Parliament. You should be able to admit that a lot has changed, and drastically. Take Ghana, for example.
We have come a long way, no doubt about that. We've made significant strides, but we're still lagging far behind where we should be. So while we encourage ourselves with the achievements that we've been able to talk up so far, we also need to recognize that, particularly women in decision making, we are a joke on the African continent and in the world. And we can do so much more because it is hurting the country's development. If we're keeping, and I liken women to being the right hand, we're keeping our right hand tied behind our backs and we're not left-handed. So you can see how we're hurting ourselves. So it is in the country's interest. You're not doing the women a favor if you create the conditions, if we all create the conditions which would enable us to excel.
Right.
We're doing the country a favor if we do that. So let's move beyond rhetoric to action and let's start taking the deliberate policies today which will ensure that by 2030 in Parliament we would have at least 120 women as against the 30 that we have. What are we going to do to make sure that we get that? In the district assemblies, we will not just have 5–10% women represented, but there will be many more.
In Parliament.
Cabinet.
In Parliament, the numbers are just, you know, not too good to talk about, right?
They've been hovering around 10% since Kwame Nkrumah's affirmative action days, where he mandated that 10 women should go to the Parliament.
Okay.
We've been hovering around the 10% mark. It's dismal. It's deplorable. We have a chance. I would love to have a doubling of the numbers of women in the next Parliament.
All right.
Meaning we should have 60. I fear we may not even be able to retain the numbers that we have. And that would be a real shame. So I'm urging the political parties, I am urging the electorate, I am urging all of us to ensure that in the next Parliament we would have at least minimum 50 women if we don't do anything at all. Let's vote at least 50 women into the next Parliament.
That's not too much to
because
ask
they
for.
act as role models for our young girls out there.
This
and
morning I was
demonstrate that
reading
we can
this
do it.
report by the is it the Guide or so, Daily Mail in the UK, and there's a suggestion that in African homes where there is poverty, in homes where women are the heads, poverty is vanishing. And I said, that's revealing. Madam Kote, what do you say about this? And particularly, and I still, want to stake my point, that I think that a lot has happened. In particularly President Mills's regime, we were told of the facts of how he promised to make 40%, was it?
40%.
Yes, 40% at all levels for women. Yeah. And he did his best to do a bit of that, particularly starting at the top echelons of power, making sure in Parliament we had a woman, at the Attorney General we had Betty Moldridrisu, of course, Madam Georgina Wood was already there. At the Shraj, we had a woman. Exactly. And so it was a good reflection of women representation in this country. So do you agree with Esla that we still have a long way to go?
Samson, it's obvious that efforts have been made. I mean, since Kwame Nkrumah's time, after the affirmative action, that efforts have been made. Subsequent presidents have tried to improve the situation. And Professor Mills, the late Professor Mills, also made a deliberate effort to try and bring women up into the higher echelons of governance. I believe that President Mahama has kept in that same stead and also tried to add on to that. And we do have a target. And of course, I mean, even Esla was saying that she has a target of seeing double the number of MP ladies in Parliament. However, it is clear that these things cannot happen overnight. It will take some time. So it will be additional. We will see it incrementally happening. And I'm glad to say that I see it happening. Okay. However, of course, I'm not satisfied with the rate at which it is increasing. I wish it could be much faster than it is now. But the good news is that it is happening. The awareness is out there. This morning we are sitting around this table, we are discussing it, and I think Esla mentioned that we have educated women. We have women who can do the job. It's now time to put them in the position so that they can show what they must do. And yes, the women are our right hands, and if we continue to keep them behind us, then we are moving forward in an awkward fashion. We need to do it in a way that will take us there. So it's that balance, that complementing each other, which is so important, and making sure that as women have the more difficult task of managing home and family and so many other issues, that they are helped to also take up this role as governance people. Right. Because even for myself, for Esla, for Prof. Jemima, we still have children that have needs that fathers can't give to them. Of course, there are many that the fathers can do for them, but there's still a lot that we have to do for them. Yes, even in the office, you will find that people come to you with other issues that they wouldn't go to the male ministers for. So we still play that dual role, even though we may even be seen as strong women and so forth. The softer issues are still there for us, and it combines to give a fantastic result. So there's no doubt that it's important that we make efforts to increase the rate at which we are promoting our women.
At least if you must have been born by a woman, you would know that it's very difficult, particularly for women, to combine all sorts of stuff. So if they're able to move out and do some of these things, they ought to be commended. You must have a sister, you have an idea what they do, you must have a wife, and particularly, and you know how it is. Now, Jemima, you must be happy also that particularly for Ghana's case, Madam Nana Oyelita has been pushing very vigorously together to get the Parliament to pass the affirmative action law, right? That should come to help.
If it ever gets passed.
If it ever gets passed?
If you have time, we can discuss it.
Oh, that's but that's a bit indicting of the Parliament. When you say if it ever gets passed.
It's not an indictment of the Parliament, it's an indictment of our society, because let's face it, MPs are representatives of the people. Now, if we consider how the Interstate Succession Amendment Law and the Property Rights of Spouses Bill was received in plenary, that's my source of apprehension that the Affirmative Action Law may also suffer a similar fate. There was such visceral opposition to it on the floor of Parliament that the Speaker had no choice but to send it back to plenary. And that was partly because they are expressing the views that their constituents express. We have an issue with attitudes towards the issues that affect largely women or improve the conditions of women and children in this country. And until we confront the patriarchal roots which feed into this phobia, fear, paranoia, I don't know what to call it. And so I think that we need to start talking up these gender-friendly, family-friendly pieces of legislation and doing the necessary mind tweaking, attitudes changing that will enable a general buy-in. And we did it with the domestic violence legislation.
Elsewhere, corporates are now giving menstrual
so we need
leave.
to start talking about it now.
Yes, now, but that's really damning that men born of women in the parliament were so vehemently against portions of the property bill for spouses, women, and interstate succession amendments, and she feels that that attitude might inform a discussion of the affirmative action bill.
It's not surprising to any of us. And I mean, when you were talking, I'm glad that you brought up the issue. It's not just about numbers. It's about attitudes. It's about social behaviors that seek to always keep women behind. And, you can have numbers, yes, and I'm not belittling the numbers, but you need to deal with the root cause. And the root cause are attitudes. Even, for example, I mean, I teach, and a lot of my students are male. And even when I initially started teaching, having a female professor in a place of authority, certain of my male students took issue to that and would give me a harder time. So there's still these attitudinal behaviors that sometimes it's almost like we polish dirt, and we say, okay, we'll have the numbers so you're a bit more visible, but still the attitudes are there. I have an open forum where my students can ask me any questions, and one of the most prevalent questions is, so how do you look after your husband? How do I look after my husband? Because I spend so much time working, So these are the kinds of attitudinal behaviors and attitudes that we have that also prevent women from going to the forefront. Because if you put yourself out, as my politician colleagues will tell you, that when you put yourself out as a woman, you're under much closer scrutiny, not only for being competent in your field, but for things of how you dress, how you comport yourself. How you speak. Yes, a man can wake up in the morning, just throw on a suit. No one will really judge him on that. But even as we're sitting here now, people are assessing our hair, our makeup, what we're wearing. Yes. And I think that...
And those doing that assessment will be women, not men, right?
Both men. Equally. And it's because the attitudes are not just of men. There's women, so we need to look at that. We need to address that.
Oh, my.
What else can I add? I've been a long-standing advocate of affirmative action.
Right.
And it goes back to one's political background, because that was a very cardinal principle of the Nkrumah-led CPP. And indeed, in terms of practice, it manifested itself not just in terms of the membership of parliament, where 10 women were selected at that time to represent 10 regions of the country, but also in terms of empowerment in other areas, the Air Force, the police service, the judiciary. There were strenuous, conscious efforts by the Nkrumah government to ensure that affirmative action was not just mere talk shop, but done in practice. Subsequent to that, you've narrated some examples in our contemporary history, and all those things are good. You know? But beyond that too, there's some of the cultural, traditional, customary,
Right.
barriers.
Right.
And the kind of mindset that we have. I think that also ought to be dealt with. It cannot just be dealt with through legislation. Legislation may help in some respects, but there are a lot of things out there that ought to
The
change.
chieftaincy ministry, if it really wants to get itself busy, that is where there is some job for it. The chieftaincy ministry, together with the houses of chiefs, the constitution requires them, and also the chieftaincy act requires them to work towards getting out of the way all laws that are repugnant to our society. I mean, traditional practices that are not in harmony with human rights and all of those things.
Yes, so
they should be doing a lot of that.
very important
because in the course of this week, we heard of widowhood rights being forced on some woman.
Yeah, it's happening. 2016.
Yes.
Well, they've rescinded that decision, but
Yeah.
even for them to think about that.
Yeah, also because one woman stood up and made a whole, issue out of it. Irene Abuchi, who has an NGO. She's a lawyer, but she has an NGO that supports some of these things.
So apart from the political aspect, we need to also, deepen the education and institutional arrangements that could be used to liberate our women.
Right.
Otherwise, I'm with
Yes.
ladies.
Something I'd like to add a little bit on the cultural thing and the attitude thing.
Okay.
Listening to the widows issue this week on Joy, it was obvious that the rationale behind some of these rights was to help women to come to closure with one chapter of their lives to be able to move on to the next. But it was the how it was being done.
Okay.
It was being done in such a mean and wicked way. And there were times when other men were taking advantage of the process. Oh, you have to sleep with me as part of moving on and all that.
That's right.
That is not right. It is right that psychologically you must be brought to a stage where you know that one chapter has ended. For some of us who've gone through that, we had some painful reminders. People had to remind us that you're no longer married and so forth, which may sound harsh, but it was useful.
Okay.
But where somebody wants to impose on your will and so forth as part of the right, which I don't think that our wise elders thousands of years ago intended.
Okay.
But it's now being added on.
Abused.
Those things we need to clean up. So you are right about chieftaincy and perhaps culture. Ministry of Culture also needs to talk about it and let women know that this is not part of the original rights of passage.
So, Madam Elizabeth Osei Asare and Madam Gamashi, yes, and Dr. Dana. Okay. Thank you very much. I think you guys should get really working on some of these things. Give some attention to them, and let's see how much progress we'll make. Now,